The desert sun hung heavy in the sky, its heat pressing down on the wooden fences in long stretches of dust that seemed to run forever across the open land. The ranch was quiet, except for the distant lowing of cattle and the scrape of boots against the hard ground. A table stood in the yard, set with tin plates and steaming food, surrounded by men who carried the weight of years spent working under the relentless sky. Their laughter rose in rough bursts, their forks clattering against metal plates as if to prove that life, though harsh, still had its small comforts. But off to the side, just out of that circle of warmth, stood a little girl with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her dress was worn thin, her shoes barely holding together. She was waiting, though no one seemed to notice her except for her father. The man at the head of the table, broad-shouldered and stern-eyed, was the kind of figure who commanded respect without asking for it. Dust clung to his hat, his weathered face set in the lines of a man who had lived long enough to see both prosperity and drought. His voice cut through the air, low but sharp enough to sting. When the girl edged closer to the table, he stopped eating, set down his fork, and said the words that sliced her small world apart. "You don't belong at the table." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every man at that table heard, and every man kept chewing, their eyes fixed on their plates, unwilling to step into the business of another. The girl froze. Her eyes welled, though she tried to hold herself still. She was small enough to be overlooked, but her silence made the rejection louder than any shout. She turned slightly, as if she might walk away, but her legs refused to move. A child should have known her place in such a household, yet something inside her still longed for a place among them, a spot where she could feel she belonged. Her breath caught, and though she tried to swallow it back, the words slipped out, cracked and trembling. "My father said, I don't belong at the table." Her voice carried, small but clear enough for someone else to hear. A man sitting apart from the rest, broad but solitary. His face softened with quietness the others didn't share, lifted his head. He had always been more shadow than spotlight at these gatherings, a ranch hand who worked hard but spoke little, the kind of man whose loneliness stretched further than the plains themselves. For years he had carried his meals alone, finding his place outside the noise. Not because he was unwanted, but because he never asked for more. Yet now, looking at the girl's downcast eyes, something stirred inside him. Without a word, he pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood on hard dirt caught the attention of those at the table, but he paid no mind. He rose, his movements unhurried, and stepped toward the child. His shadow fell over her, and she lifted her face just enough to see his hand reach for a chair. It wasn't much, just an old wooden seat with one leg slightly uneven, but the act itself felt heavier than the words her father had spoken. He set the chair down beside her. His voice was roughened by years of wind and smoke. Yet there was gentleness in it as he said, "Here's your place." He didn't glance at the father, or at the men who had stopped chewing to watch. He only looked at her, steady and calm, as if daring the world to say she didn't deserve to sit. The girl blinked, torn between shame and hope. She hesitated, her hands still locked before her, afraid of angering the one who had cast her aside. The lonely rancher kept his hand on the back of the chair, waiting, making no demand, but offering what no one else would. Behind them, the laughter at the table faded into a silence that carried more weight than words. The air hung thick as though the whole ranch held its breath. Waiting to see if the child would take the seat that had been denied to her, the father's fork struck against his plate, sharp and final, breaking the stillness. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was worse than thunder. The girl felt it press against her chest, that storm of unspoken authority. Yet beside her, the rancher's presence was steady, as immovable as the fence posts driven deep into the earth. She shifted her foot, the dust rising at her step, and for the first time she dared to wonder, what if she did sit down? What if she accepted the kindness of the one man who seemed to notice her worth? Would it change anything, or would it only bring more wrath upon her small shoulders? Her lip trembled as she stood caught between fear and longing. The rancher didn't move. He didn't push her forward, but he didn't walk away either. His silence spoke louder than any promise. If she sat, she wouldn't sit alone. The girl's eyes darted to her father, then back to the chair. The men at the table lowered their gazes, some ashamed, others hardened, unwilling to betray what they really thought. The cattle in the distance moaned, a lonely sound stretching across the land, as if even the earth itself waited for her choice. Her hand twitched, rising slowly as though reaching for something fragile. She touched the back of the chair, feeling the rough wood beneath her small fingers. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Her father's breath was steady but heavy, the rancher's eyes calm yet fierce in their quiet resolve, and the men around the table sat suspended in a silence so deep it could shatter at any moment. Would she take her place? Or would she step back into the dust and shadows? And there, in that pause between courage and fear, the moment hung broken, uncertain, waiting for what would come next. The girl's hand lingered on the back of the chair, her fingers curling around the worn wood as though it might give her strength. The chair was nothing special, just another piece of furniture that had been hauled across rough country and patched up too many times to count. Yet in that moment, it was more than a chair. It was a place, a chance, a space where she could belong if only she dared to sit. The silence stretched, heavy and uneasy, as though the wind itself had hushed to listen. Behind her, the rancher stood tall, steady, and patient. But he was no stranger to waiting. He had waited his whole life for something to give him reason, something to hold on to. Maybe this child, trembling in the dust, was part of it. Her father's gaze was fixed on her, sharp as a branding iron. He didn't need to speak. The weight of his silence told her everything she already knew. She had been raised under his shadow, learning early that words could wound more than fists, that his approval was harder to earn than rain in a dry season. She knew what he expected. She knew her place was not at that table. Still, the chair called to her, the way cool water calls to the thirsty. Her breath caught in her throat as her knees bent ever so slightly, as though she might lower herself into it. But before she could move further, her father leaned back, his fork clattering against his tin plate once again. She froze. The rancher's hand stayed on the chair, steady and sure. His eyes did not leave the child's face, though he could feel the heat of the father's stare burning into him. He had worked for the man long enough to know his pride, long enough to know that defying him came with a price. But something about the girl's small, fragile defiance reached a place inside him that had long been locked away. He remembered what it was like to be turned away, to be told there was no place for him. He remembered the sting of silence when a man's worth was measured in land and cattle and not in the quiet things that made him human. The girl pulled her hand back and stepped away, her eyes falling to the ground. The chair stood there waiting, but she didn't claim it. She turned slightly, her bare feet stirring the dust, and took a step back toward the shadows of the barn. The rancher let his hand drop from the chair, but his eyes followed her, a quiet ache settling into his chest. The men at the table began to talk again, their voices forced, as though trying to erase the unease that had settled over them. Plates clattered, cups scraped against wood, and laughter came too loud, too sharp. But the wound in the air was still there, raw and open. That night, as the ranch grew quiet and the last embers of the fire dimmed, the girl lay on a thin blanket in a corner of the house, staring up at the ceiling beams. Her stomach ached with hunger, but it was not the worst of her pains. What gnawed at her was the thought that maybe her father was right. Maybe she didn't belong at the table, or anywhere at all. The walls felt cold, even in the lingering heat of the day, and her small frame curled tighter as if she could disappear outside. The lonely rancher sat on the steps of the bunkhouse, the night spread wide around him. The stars shone hard and bright, a sky so vast it seemed to swallow every thought. He lit a match and held it to a roll of tobacco, the glow briefly lighting his weathered face. His mind went back to the girl, her eyes full of something he had seen before, the same emptiness that had haunted him as a boy when he too was told to stand aside. He wondered if she would remember this day for the rest of her life, the way he remembered his. He wondered if she would grow strong from it, or if it would leave her always doubting her place in the world. The ranch itself carried its own silence, one not born of peace, but of things unsaid. Men worked long hours and spoke little, the clatter of tools and the lowing of cattle filling most of the space between them. It was a hard life, one that demanded obedience, strength, and silence. For the girl, there was no softness in the days. She rose before dawn to fetch water, scrubbed clothes until her fingers were raw, and listened for the sharp bark of her father's voice, always ready to move before his anger rose. She knew every creak of the floorboards, every sound of the corral gate swinging in the wind, every rhythm of the ranch that told her whether the day would pass quietly or with storm. Yet the chair stayed in her mind. She thought of it while hauling buckets, while sweeping the dust that never stayed gone, while standing in the doorway watching the men eat. She thought of the rancher, too, the one who had dared to pull it out for her. He was different from the others. He spoke less, worked harder, and his eyes carried a weight that told her he knew loneliness. He never looked at her with scorn, never turned his face away. It was not affection, exactly, but it was something closer to recognition. The men whispered sometimes about him, calling him odd, calling him soft-hearted, which in their world was not a compliment. They said he had no family, no place to call his own, that he drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying longer than the seasons allowed. But he had stayed here on this land, longer than anyone expected. Maybe it was the work. Maybe it was the girl. No one asked, and he never said. As weeks passed, the tension between the father and the rancher thickened, though few spoke of it. The father was a man of pride, a man who believed that order came from strictness and distance. His house was his kingdom, and his word was law. The rancher, though quiet, had a way of defying without speaking. It was not open rebellion, but a steady, patient refusal to look away from things others ignored. The girl found herself caught between them, drawn to the one who offered her kindness, but bound by fear of the one who held her. There were days when she thought of running, of slipping out under the cover of darkness and following the road until it disappeared into the horizon. But the world beyond the fences was wide and unforgiving. She had nowhere to go, no hand to hold but her own, and so she stayed, waiting, hoping, and fearing in equal measure. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of red and gold, she lingered by the barn where the rancher was mending a bridle. He didn't look up when she approached, but he didn't send her away either. She stood in silence, watching his hands work the leather, steady and sure. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you pull out the chair?" His hands stilled, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he set the bridle down and looked at her, his eyes soft in the fading light. "Because everyone deserves a place at the table." His words were simple. They carried a weight she felt deep in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that someone like her could have a place anywhere. But the echo of her father's voice still lingered in her mind, sharp and final. The girl lowered her eyes, unsure if she could carry the hope he had offered. The rancher picked up the bridle again, his silence saying more than words. She stood there longer than she should have, listening to the rhythm of his work, wishing that his words could be true. That night, as the house grew quiet and the ranch slipped into darkness, the girl dreamed of the chair again. She dreamed of sitting down, of feeling the rough wood beneath her legs and the weight of belonging settling into her bones. She dreamed of her father's eyes watching, of the men's silence, and of the rancher's steady presence beside her. When she woke, the dream clung to her like the smell of smoke after a fire, leaving her restless and unsettled. The chair was still waiting, though no one spoke of it. It stood as a silent reminder of what could be, of what had been denied. And though she had not yet taken her seat, the thought of it would not leave her. Neither would the question of how long the rancher's quiet defiance could stand against her father's pride. Something was coming, though none of them could yet see what shape it would take. And so the days rolled on. Dust rising under the hooves of cattle, the sun burning down on the fields, and the weight of unspoken words pressing heavier with each passing hour. The girl's place was still uncertain, the chair still empty, and the air between father and rancher grew tighter with every glance, every silence, every unvoiced challenge that seemed bound to break. Would the girl ever sit at the table? Or would the ranch itself swallow her into the dust before she found her place? The answer lay somewhere ahead, waiting like a storm on the horizon. Dark and inevitable, the air on the ranch grew heavier with each passing week, though nothing was said outright. The cattle still grazed in the pastures, the men still rose at dawn, and the father still commanded the household with the same iron hand as always. Yet beneath the rhythm of ranch life, something unspoken stretched tight, like a rope pulled to its limit. It was felt in the way the men lowered their voices when the rancher passed, in the way the girl moved cautiously through the house, and in the way the father's eyes narrowed whenever silence lasted too long. The girl carried her tasks, as she always had, hauling buckets, gathering kindling, and sweeping dust that returned as quickly as it was chased away. But the image of the chair haunted her, and the memory of the rancher's voice lingered in her mind. She noticed things more now: how some of the men looked uneasy when her father barked commands, how a few cast quick glances toward the rancher as though testing his reaction. The rancher rarely spoke, but his silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of a man content with loneliness. It was the silence of someone watching, waiting, weighing each moment, as though he knew the ground was shifting under them all. The father, for his part, seemed sharper. His words cut quicker. His temper rose faster, though he still cloaked his anger in a veneer of control. He had worked too long to build his land, to bend men to his will, to let even the smallest sign of defiance slip unnoticed. And the chair, though no one mentioned it, had not been forgotten. Each meal, the girl lingered at the edges, and though she never sat, the memory of her near step toward that seat seemed to burn like a scar in her father's mind. Pride was his compass, and pride would not allow weakness in his house. One evening, while the men were gathered in the bunkhouse, the talk turned toward the rancher. They spoke low, their words wrapped in smoke from cheap tobacco, their faces shadowed by the flicker of lantern light. Some muttered that he was too soft, that he would cause trouble. Others said nothing, only listening, their unease clear in the tightness of their jaws. A few, though, wondered if perhaps he was right to do what he had done. The ranch was harsh, and the father harsher still. They had seen the girl work harder than any child should, her small body carrying burdens she was never meant to bear. Yet none dared to speak openly, for the father's reach extended everywhere. To cross him was to risk more than a place at the table. It was to risk a place on the ranch itself. The rancher knew what they said. He had felt their eyes on him, heard the shifting tones when he entered a room. But he carried it as he always had, quiet and steady, letting the work speak where words would only inflame. Still at night, when the world grew silent, he could not ignore the truth. He had stepped into something larger than he intended. By pulling out that chair, he had drawn a line between himself and the father. And though neither had spoken of it since, the conflict was alive in every glance. Every silence that fell heavier than words, the girl, caught in the middle, found herself watching more closely. She noticed how the father stiffened when the rancher was near, how the rancher's eyes stayed calm but unyielding, and how the men shifted between them like cattle sensing a storm. She had no power to stop it, yet she felt as though her very existence was the spark that had lit the fire. Some night, she dreamed of the chair again, but now the dream shifted. Sometimes she sat and felt warmth spread through her chest. Other times she sat and felt her father's anger crash down like a hammer. She never knew which ending the dream would bring. Life on the ranch gave little room for dreams. There was always work to do. One morning, the father took the men out to round up cattle straying too far into the hills. The girl stayed behind, sent to gather firewood near the creek. The rancher remained as well, tasked with mending a fence that had been broken by a restless steer. When she saw him at the fence line, hammer in hand, she paused. The sound of each strike echoed across the field, steady and certain. She lingered, unsure if she should speak. But the memory of his words, the simple truth that everyone deserves a place, drew her closer. He looked up as she approached, sweat streaking the dust on his brow. "You're supposed to be gathering wood," he said, his tone even, not scolding. "I will," she replied softly. Then after a pause, "Do you ever wish you had a place at the table?" The hammer stilled in his hand. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the broken plank he had been mending. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I've spent most of my life outside the table. Some days I wish it. Some days I don't, but I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong." She nodded, though the weight of his words pressed heavy on her chest. Why does he hate me so much? The rancher set the hammer down, leaning against the fence. His eyes, dark and steady, held hers. "I don't think he hates you. He just doesn't know how to see you. Some men are blinded by their own pride. They think control is the same as love." The girl swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't know what to say, but his words burrowed deep, planting a seed of something she couldn't name. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she wasn't the problem. But the doubt lingered like a shadow she couldn't outrun. As summer deepened, the conflict simmered. The father grew more suspicious, the rancher more watchful, and the girl more torn between fear and hope. Subplots wove through the tension, as though the ranch itself was complicit in holding the story tight. One of the younger hands, restless and reckless, began to test the father's patience with sloppy work and too much drink. Another, older and worn, whispered warnings to the girl when no one watched, telling her to keep her head down, to survive until she was old enough to leave. These small threads deepened the weight of the ranch, making it clear that the girl was not the only one crushed beneath the father's pride, yet all paths seemed to lead back to the chair. To that one act that had changed everything. The father could not let it go, though he never spoke of it. His eyes told the story, each glance a reminder that he had been challenged in his own house. And the rancher, though he kept to his work, carried himself differently now. It was subtle, but undeniable. He no longer bent so easily to the father's word. He no longer let silence erase what had been seen. He was not yet defiant, but he was no longer invisible. The girl sensed it building, the gathering of a storm on the far horizon. She could not say when it would break, only that it would. The ranch was a place of order, of routine, of rules, carved into the earth as deeply as the fence posts. But something was shifting, something that no amount of silence or work could hold back. The father's pride, the rancher's quiet defiance, the girl's longing for belonging, all of it pressed closer and closer, tightening with each passing day. One evening, as the sun sank low and the men gathered again at the long table, the girl lingered by the barn door. The smell of food drifted toward her, rich and tempting. Her stomach growled, but it was not hunger that kept her standing there. It was the chair, empty, waiting, its rough wood catching the last glow of the sun. She felt the weight of every eye on her, though no one had turned their heads. The rancher's gaze was steady, the father's sharp, the men's uncertain. Her foot moved forward, stirring the dust, and the silence thickened once more. The conflict that had lived unspoken in the air now hovered on the edge of breaking, the chair standing between them like a question that could no longer be ignored, and in that silence, the ranch seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the moment when everything would finally crack. The days turned restless on the ranch. Though the routine never changed, the cattle were driven to water, the horses brushed down, the fences patched, and the land worked until the sun fell heavy across the sky. But beneath that rhythm, an unease grew sharper with every passing day. It was felt in the way men exchanged glances when the father's voice cut through the air, in the way their laughter faltered when the rancher's eyes lingered on the child, and in the way the girl herself carried her small frame as though she bore more weight than she should. The father had grown watchful, his pride prickling like a thorn that refused to be pulled. He had built his place with his own 2 hands, carved it out of dust and sweat, and no one dared question his rule. Yet now, without a single word spoken in defiance, the rancher had unsettled him. The chair had become more than wood. It had become a mark of challenge. The girl did not sit in it, but the memory of that moment, her hand on the backrest. His eyes on her burned in the father's mind like a brand. Each meal since, the empty seat stood as a reminder, and each time he saw his daughter's eyes shift toward it, he felt his control slipping. The rancher knew it too. He could feel the father's gaze, heavy as the sun at noon, pressing down with silent warning. He was not a man who sought conflict. His life had been marked by moving on when trouble grew too thick, leaving behind whatever he could not change. But something in this place held him, kept him rooted where he might otherwise have walked away. Maybe it was the girl's trembling voice, the way she had said she didn't belong. Maybe it was the land itself, hard but familiar. Or maybe it was the truth he had carried his whole life, that silence could be heavier than words. Sometimes it had to be broken. The girl felt the storm rising most of all. She knew her father's moods better than anyone. She saw the tightness in his jaw when the rancher passed, the way his fork struck the plate with sharper edges, the way his voice rose more often when giving orders. She also saw the rancher's calm, the way his silence no longer bent, the way his eyes no longer looked away. She lived in the space between them, caught in a pull that left her heart racing even in quiet moments. At night, she dreamed of the chair again, but now the dream grew darker. She saw herself sit, and the table shook. She saw her father rise, his shadow spreading long. And always, she woke before knowing what came next. The ranch hands carried their own unease. One young hand, restless and careless, muttered one evening that the girl should have been allowed to sit. His words, half drowned in drink, made the others fall silent. An older man warned him sharply to hold his tongue, for the father's pride was not something to trifle with. But the words lingered, whispered at the edges of their work, until even those who said nothing found themselves wondering what it might mean if she did take her place. Some began to see the rancher as more than just a quiet worker. They saw him as a man standing where they had never dared, and it unsettled them as much as it gave them a strange, hidden hope. The father, though, felt the shift. He noticed how silence lingered when he entered a room, how men straightened quicker, how their laughter sounded forced. He saw how the rancher's steady presence seemed to draw eyes, even when he said nothing at all. It gnawed at him, the thought that his control was being chipped away not by open rebellion but by quiet defiance. By a single chair, in the eyes of a child. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in streaks of fire, the men gathered for supper. The girl lingered by the barn door, her bare feet pressed into the dirt, her eyes on the chair. The rancher sat in his place, his fork unmoving, his gaze steady as though waiting for something. The father, at the head of the table, raised his cup and spoke, his voice sharp in the cooling air. "This table is for men who earn their place," he said, his eyes never leaving the rancher. "Those who don't belong, stay in the shadows." The words hung heavy. The men shifted uncomfortably, some glancing down at their plates, others casting brief, uneasy looks toward the barn. The girl felt the sting of her father's words even from where she stood, though they had not been directed at her alone. Her chest tightened, her hands trembling at her sides. The rancher did not answer, but his silence carried weight. He took another slow bite, his eyes still fixed on the father. The tension grew so thick, it seemed to press against every breath. The days that followed were filled with small, unspoken battles. Orders given by the father were met with the rancher's quiet, steady compliance, but not deference. The girl found herself drawn more and more to the rancher's side, finding in his silence a comfort her father's voice never gave. He taught her small things without saying much: how to tie a knot tighter, how to spot the signs of a restless horse, how to carry weight without breaking her back. Each moment was small, but to her, it was more than she had ever been given. And each time her father noticed, his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as though the very sight cut at his pride. The tension stretched until even the land seemed to carry it. The cattle grew restless, the horses kicked harder, and the wind whistled through the fence posts with a sharpness that echoed the unease in men's hearts. Work became shorter, tempers quicker, and the ranch felt as though it was waiting for something to break. The girl felt it too, a constant pull in her chest, as though the chair itself called to her more strongly with each passing day. One night, when the stars hung clear and cold, she crept from her place in the house and wandered toward the bunkhouse. The rancher was there, sitting alone on the steps, his face lit by the glow of a small lantern. She sat beside him without a word, her small frame curling against the night air. For a long time they said nothing, listening to the chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, she whispered, "He'll never let me sit." The rancher looked at her, his eyes steady and calm. "Maybe not," he said softly. but you don't need his permission to belong." The words sank deep, heavier than anything she had ever heard. Belonging had always been something she thought had to be given. To hear it could be claimed stirred something fierce inside her, something that frightened her as much as it gave her hope. She turned her face toward the dark horizon, her heart pounding with thoughts she couldn't quite name. The next morning, the father's voice cut sharper than ever. He barked orders at the men, his anger spilling into every word. He sensed something he could not control slipping further, and his pride pushed him harder, louder, harsher. The men obeyed, but the quiet between them told the story. The rancher worked silently, but his silence now felt like resistance. And the girl, watching from the edge, felt the storm drawing closer with every step. Every glance, every word unsaid. By evening, the table was set again. The men gathered, their movements stiff, their eyes wary. The girl stood near the barn once more, her gaze fixed on the chair. The rancher sat in his place, his shoulders steady, his eyes calm. The father lifted his cup, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "This house is mine," he declared, his tone sharp as the crack of a whip. "No man tells me who belongs at my table." The silence that followed was sharper than the words themselves. The girl felt her breath catch, her heart racing as though something inside her knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. The rancher's fork rested on his plate, his hands steady, his eyes locked on the father. The men looked between them, their faces tense, her hands frozen mid-dash meal. The girl took a step forward, the dust rising beneath her feet, her eyes locked on the chair, her small hands clenched at her sides. Every sound on the ranch seemed to hush the cattle, the horses, the wind itself. The father's eyes snapped to her, his jaw tight, his face carved with the weight of pride and anger. The rancher's gaze followed too, steady and unyielding. The chair stood empty still, waiting, daring, demanding. And in that moment, with the sun bleeding into darkness and the silence stretching tighter than ever, the storm that had been gathering loomed on the edge of breaking. Ready to crash down on them all? The dust swirled around her small feet as the girl stood frozen, her eyes locked on the chair that seemed larger than the world itself. Every heartbeat thudded in her chest like the strike of a drum, echoing in the silence that fell heavy over the ranch yard. The father's gaze bore into her, sharp as a blade, his pride flaring like fire. The rancher's eyes, calm and steady, gave no command but offered quiet strength. The men at the table sat stiff, their forks hovering, waiting to see which way the storm would break. The girl's hand trembled, then steadied. She took another step toward the chair, her breath shallow, but her will fierce. The father's face tightened, his jaw hard, but he did not speak. The rancher's hand rested lightly on the table, his silence louder than any shout. And then, with a courage that seemed far bigger than her small frame, the girl pulled the chair out, lowered herself onto it, and sat. The sound was simple, the scrape of wood against dirt, the creak of old legs settling into place, but it carried across the ranch like thunder. The men lowered their eyes, some ashamed, some relieved. The father's chest rose with a sharp breath, but no words came. His control had always been his strength, but now it bound him in silence. For to speak would mean admitting what he could no longer stop. The rancher did not move, did not gloat, did not speak. His calm presence held the moment together, giving it weight without violence. The girl sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, as though she knew this was more than sitting at a table it was claiming. Her place in the world, for a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the fence posts, carrying away the sharpness of the moment. At last, the father lowered his eyes to his plate. He lifted his fork and ate. His silence was surrender, though his pride burned hot. The men followed suit one by one, resuming their meal, though the air had changed. Something had shifted that could not be undone. The girl ate too. Her bite small, her movements careful. But inside her heart swelled with something new, belonging. She had taken her place not because it was given, because she had chosen it. She glanced at the rancher, and though he gave no nod, no smile, the steadiness in his eyes was enough. That night, the ranch felt different. The men spoke in softer tones, as though aware they had witnessed something larger than themselves. The father sat apart, his cup in hand, his silence heavier than usual. He did not call out to the girl, did not strike her with words, but his presence was colder. He had not been defeated openly, but a piece of his authority had cracked, and everyone knew it. The rancher sat on the bunkhouse steps once again, the lantern glowing beside him. The girl slipped quietly into the yard and stood nearby. For a moment, they said nothing, listening to the crickets sing in the dark. Finally, she whispered, "I sat." The rancher's eyes softened. "I know." Her hands fidgeted, unsure of what came next. "He didn't stop me." "No," the rancher said, his voice low. "Sometimes silence is the only way a man can save what's left of himself." She thought about that, her brow furrowing. The father had not shouted, had not dragged her away, but his silence had felt louder than anything. Still, she had stayed, and for the first time, she believed she could stay again. The days that followed did not erase the tension, but they settled into a new rhythm. The girl sat at the table each evening, her presence small but undeniable. The men adjusted quickly, their eyes no longer darting toward her, their silence no longer sharp. They accepted it as part of the new order. The father never spoke of it, his pride refusing to name what had happened, but he did not forbid it either. His authority had bent, though he pretended it had not. The rancher continued his work, quiet as ever, but the way the men looked at him changed. Where once they had seen only loneliness, now they saw strength. He had not shouted, had not fought, but his act had shifted the balance of the ranch. Some of the younger hands watched him with new respect, while the older ones carried an unspoken relief. The rancher had stood where none of them dared. The land itself seemed to breathe easier for it. The girl, though, carried the change most deeply. She worked still, fetching water and sweeping floors, but she carried herself differently now. Her shoulders no longer hunched beneath invisible weight, her eyes no longer darted with constant fear. She had learned that belonging was not always given, it could be claimed. Each time she sat at the table, she reminded herself of that truth. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of red, the father finally spoke. His voice was not as sharp as before, though it carried the same weight. "The table is for those who earn it," he said, his eyes fixed on the rancher. "Remember that." The rancher met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "She's earning it every day," he said simply. The words hung heavy, but they were true. The girl's work, her endurance, her courage, they were proof enough. The father said nothing more, but his silence carried less strength now. He could not undo what had been done. The ranch went on as it always had, the cattle still grazing, the fences still needing repair, the dust still rising with every step. But for the girl, everything had changed. She had claimed her place, and no amount of silence or pride could take it away. She would always remember the scrape of that chair, the moment when she chose to sit, in the steady presence of the rancher who had given her the chance. The rancher, too, found himself changed. For years he had drifted, never planting roots, never claiming more than work and solitude. But now, as he watched the girl grow stronger, he felt something stir inside him, something like belonging. He was still a man apart, still marked by loneliness, but he no longer carried it alone. The ranch, harsh and unyielding, had given him a place too, though it was not the table that mattered. It was the act of standing, of refusing to look away, of offering a chair when no one else would, as the seasons turned. The ranch endured its hardships and its blessings, its droughts and its rains. The men came and went, but the girl remained, her presence no longer shadowed but part of the heart of the place. The father never softened much, but his pride was tempered by the quiet strength he could not erase. He never admitted it, but deep inside he knew his daughter had earned more than he had ever given her. Years later, when the girl looked back, she would remember the dust in the air, the silence around the table, and the scrape of the chair that changed everything. She would remember the rancher's calm eyes, the weight of her father's pride, and the way belonging had to be. Claimed, not begged for. And she would carry that truth into every place she walked. A lesson carved as deeply into her as the lines of the land itself. The ranch itself seemed to hold on to the memory too. Each evening, when the men gathered and the chairs stood filled, the air carried a quiet reminder of the day. A child sat down and changed the rhythm of the house. The land had seen countless storms, countless men come and go, but it held that moment as surely as it held the cattle and the fences and the endless sky. In the end, the story of the chair was not just about a place at the table. It was about courage, about the quiet strength of those who dare to claim what is theirs, about the way silence can wound but also protect, and about how even in the harshest places, belonging can be found. The girl had wept once, believing she was unwanted. But when she sat, when she stayed, she learned the truth. She belonged not because her father allowed it, not because the men accepted it, but because she chose it. And that choice made all the difference. And so the ranch carried on, its dust rising with every hoofbeat, its fences standing against the wind, its table filled each evening. But for those who had seen it, who had lived it, the scrape of that chair would never be forgotten. It was the sound of change, the sound of belonging claimed, the sound of a story that would outlast them all.